Malorie informs her children that they are embarking on a perilous journey, one that requires them to keep their blindfolds on at all costs. They must not speak during the trip, especially on the river. Malorie tells them that if they hear any strange sounds, they should tell her, but they must never remove their blindfolds, as doing so would result in death. With her pet birds, children, and a boat, Malorie sets off on her journey down the river. 5 years earlier, Malorie, an aspiring artist, was pregnant and living in isolation after a divorce. She had been keeping herself locked inside for several days. Her sister Jessica urged her to listen to the news, and Malorie turned on the TV, discovering that a strange virus was spreading across Europe. The infected were exhibiting bizarre behavior and committing suicide. Malorie, brushing it off, reassured Jessica that it hadn't reached the States yet. During a regular checkup, Malorie told Dr. Lathan that she didn't want to know the gender of the baby, wanting to keep it a surprise. Malorie and Jessica joked about drinking, but Dr. Lathan reprimanded them for making light of the situation. The doctor also suggested that if Malorie wasn't ready for motherhood, she could consider adoption by couples eager for children. On the way out of the hospital, Malorie saw a young girl violently hitting her head against the glass. The girl, whom Malorie had seen earlier in a healthy state, was now showing signs of the infection. Malorie, growing anxious, urged Jessica to hurry. Soon they began witnessing chaos as the virus began to spread rapidly. When Malorie turned to grab Jessica's phone, she saw Jessica frozen, seemingly possessed by the entity. This led to a car crash that left them both injured. Despite their survival, Jessica tragically ended her life right in front of Malorie. As they struggled to escape, Malorie witnessed a woman who tried to help but was also possessed by the entity and exploded in a burning car. A boy named Tom aided Malorie and her children, eventually taking them to Greg's house. Other survivors in the house included Charlie, Douglas, Felix, Cheryl, and a couple named Jason and Samantha. Malorie mourned Jessica's loss, and Douglas, ever grim, warned everyone that they wouldn't survive for long. As Malorie tried to call her mother, Tom insisted that they board up the windows. On TV, the president urged people to stay indoors, but the broadcast was cut off soon after. Charlie declared that the world was ending, attributing it to divine judgment. Tom asked Malorie if she was all right, and through tears, Malorie told him how her sister, who had been fine, suddenly saw something and took her life. She also shared how a woman tried to help her, but when Malorie turned to ask about her, Douglas became angry and clarified that the woman was Lydia, his wife, who had died long ago. Back in the present, 6 hours into their boat trip, Malorie, covered by curtains, attempted to contact anyone over the walkie-talkie, but received no response. The birds began chirping, signaling the presence of the entity. In the past, it had been 3 days since the survivors locked themselves in the house. They were running low on food and began discussing supplies. A woman knocked at the door, and while Tom was willing to help her, Douglas protested. Malorie pointed a gun at him and insisted that Tom assist her. They covered their eyes to check if the woman, Olympia, was infected, and finding she wasn't, allowed her to enter. Olympia, also pregnant, spoke about needing food supplies. Greg mentioned that they could use the cameras to observe what was happening outside, but Malorie warned that images might hold power. Greg, however, risked it and checked the cameras. Upon doing so, he became possessed by the entity, his eye color changing. The survivors rushed to him, but he was already dead by the time they reached him. Douglas destroyed the computer, and Malorie cried as she saw the blood of Greg. Malorie and Olympia spoke about baby names, and Malorie was touched when Olympia asked about her family. Malorie unexpectedly witnessed Lucy and Felix having sex, and she laughed with Tom about it. Back in the present, 14 hours had passed on the river. Malorie heard a man's voice offering food and urging them to remove their blindfolds. Malorie told the children to ignore him and hide. The possessed man attempted to remove Malorie's blindfold, but she fought him off and after losing her gun, used another weapon to knock him out. She continued her journey. Back in the past, Tom insisted that they go outside to get food, and a group of 5, including Charlie, Malorie, Douglas, Tom, and Lucy, set out for a supermarket. They painted their car windows black and used the GPS to navigate. On the road, they ran over dead bodies and were horrified to realize they were surrounded by the entity. They reached the supermarket while wearing blindfolds and collected a large supply of food. Tom and Malorie bonded during the trip, and Malorie found pet birds at the market. As they were leaving, they heard a man knocking at the door. Tom opened it slightly, but the birds began chirping wildly, signaling that the man was infected. Charlie bravely sacrificed himself to protect the others, and they saw blood everywhere. They made it back to the house, only to discover that Felix and Lucy had stolen the vehicle. Back in the present, 24 hours had passed on the river. Malorie was exhausted when their boat collided with another abandoned one, and one of the children fell into the river. Malorie managed to rescue the child, but lost all their food and belongings. She reached the riverbank and told the children to stay in the boat while she went to gather supplies. Malorie found an unfamiliar house and entered, only to realize the entity was present when everything began to move on its own. Malorie grabbed her gun and began firing blindly. The girl tried to help, but the entity surrounded her. Malorie pulled her back into the boat and warned the children that they must save themselves if anything happens to her. In the past, Tom shared his story about Iraq with Malorie and they grew closer. Olympia allowed a desperate man named Gary into the house. Malorie pointed a gun at him, but Tom checked him out. Gary claimed that he and his friend had been forced to look at the entity and his friend had died. Gary also mentioned that some people outside willingly wanted to see the entity and weren't wearing blindfolds. Despite his claims, Douglas didn't trust Gary and aimed a gun at him. Cheryl, Greg's mother, knocked Douglas out with a vase, and Gary was allowed to stay. Olympia, crying, told Malorie that she felt like a burden. Malorie comforted her, and Olympia gave Malorie a cat doll as a gift. Back in the present, the girl held the same cat doll, showing that she was Olympia's daughter. It had been 38 hours on the river. Malorie told the children they would soon face dangerous rapids, and one of them would need to look outside to guide her. Both Malorie and Olympia went into labor. Gary revealed pictures of monsters, stating that he was there to make people infected. He put the birds in the freezer and opened the windows, which Douglas saw. Gary knocked Tom out and opened the window in Douglas's room. Malorie gave birth to a boy, and Olympia had a girl. When Gary opened the windows, Cheryl and Malorie quickly covered their eyes, but Olympia saw the entity and became possessed. Malorie took the baby from Olympia before she died. Cheryl was also possessed by Gary, who killed Douglas, but Tom killed Gary. 5 years later, Malorie taught the children how to function with blindfolds. She and Tom were living together, raising the two children. However, Malorie still hadn't named them. They saw people driving without blindfolds. Tom and Malorie finally connected to a radio, and a man named Rick told them there was a safe community across the river, though it would be dangerous for the children to cross. Malorie was reluctant to believe this after Gary's betrayal. Survivors from earlier broke into the house, and Tom confronted them. He forced Malorie to leave with the children for safety. Tom killed the marauders, but was eventually possessed by the entity. He fought back, but was lost. Malorie, now determined, decided to go to the community. In the present, it had been 48 hours on the river. As they approached the rapids, Malorie decided that no one would look outside and they would leave their fate to the river. They narrowly survived the rapids, the forest, and the entity. When Malorie reached the house, she knocked on the door frantically. Finally, she arrived at the compound where she met Rick and discovered that the community was based in a former school for the blind, explaining why the inhabitants were immune to the entity. There, she found other people and children living peacefully. Malorie released the birds and met Dr. Laffin, where she revealed the children's names, Olympia for the girl and Tom for the boy.